In the heart of a quiet, scenic ski resort, JD Vance found himself facing one of the most unexpected and uncomfortable moments of his career. This wasn't a political rally or a debate in a high-stakes environment. This was a vacation, a much-needed break from the relentless pressure of politics and public scrutiny. Or at least, that's what he thought. Vance had barely stepped onto the ski slopes when he noticed the first signs that something was off. A group of protesters had gathered near the lodge, carrying signs and chanting slogans against his political views. At first, he assumed it was a passing inconvenience, something that could easily be ignored. After all, he had been in the public eye for years, and protests were hardly a new experience. But this time, it felt different. There was something personal about it, something far more intense than the typical political protest. The protesters were everywhere. They lined the entrance to the resort, their voices growing louder as Vance made his way to the ski lift. The chants became more aggressive, and the atmosphere seemed to thicken with hostility. The crowd wasn't just targeting him for his political stances. They were attacking his very character, his motives, his integrity. For a brief moment, Vance wondered if this would escalate into something more than just a few chants. For a man who had spent much of his life navigating the rough terrain of politics, this was a completely different type of challenge. It wasn't the usual back and forth in the halls of Congress or in televised debates. This was something personal, a direct confrontation where the public wasn't asking for answers. They were demanding accountability. As Vance made his way toward the lift, a group of protesters approached him directly, blocking his path. Their faces were set with an unmistakable intensity. "Hey, JD," one of them shouted. "How does it feel to be the face of division in this country?" The crowd grew larger, and for a moment Vance thought about simply walking away. It would have been easy. He could have easily retreated into the comfort of the lodge, avoided the confrontation, and continued with his trip. But something inside him shifted. This wasn't just about avoiding discomfort, it was about standing firm. This moment could be a defining one, not only for his public image but for the way he handled adversity. With all eyes on him, Vance took a deep breath. The protesters weren't going to back down, but neither was he. He didn't move. He simply stood there, calmly looking out at the group. The protesters, sensing that he wasn't going to just walk away, began to push harder, their words cutting through the air. But Vance wasn't about to be taken off guard. He knew exactly what he had to do. The protesters surrounded JD Vance, their voices growing louder with every passing second. The intensity of the moment was palpable. They were not just questioning his policies, they were questioning his character, accusing him of being a divider rather than a unifier, a hypocrite who didn't care about the very people he claimed to represent. Vance stood there, his posture calm and unwavering. He had dealt with crowds like this before, but something about this moment felt different. It wasn't the usual shouting from a distance or the standard political dissent. These people were right in front of him, demanding answers. The eyes of the entire resort were upon him. It felt like everything had built up to this moment, where he would have to decide whether to stand tall or back down. The protesters shouted their slogans, calling out his political beliefs, criticizing his wealth, and accusing him of being out of touch with the everyday Americans he claimed to represent. Their words hit with precision, and Vance could feel the pressure mounting. Some of them were holding signs that read, "Hypocrite on the slopes," and "Corporate elites don't care about you." For a moment, Vance stood frozen, listening to the crowd. The feeling of being cornered was something he had felt before in his political career. But this time, there was no press, no cameras catching every word. It was just him and the people, face to face. It would have been easy to retaliate with words just as sharp, to point out their hypocrisy, to call them out on their accusations. After all, he had been mocked, criticized, and vilified countless times before. But instead, Vance did something no one expected. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and then he raised his hand slowly, signaling to the protesters to quiet down. His voice, when he finally spoke, was measured and calm, cutting through the noise. "I understand your frustration," he said, looking directly at the protesters, his tone firm but not aggressive. "I get that you're upset, that you feel like the system isn't working for you. I hear it. I hear it from people all across this country. You're not alone." The crowd's shouting died down for a moment, the atmosphere shifting. Vance continued, his words resonating with sincerity. "But here's the thing. I didn't get into politics to make things worse. I got into this fight because I want to do something about the problems that matter. The economic struggles, the broken system, the lack of real opportunity. If you think I'm out of touch, then I'm sorry. But I can't change the way I believe things should be fixed." The protesters were momentarily silent. Some had stepped back, surprised by Vance's directness and honesty, and others seemed caught off guard by his refusal to get defensive or angry. Vance wasn't just standing there as a politician. He was standing as a man who, despite his disagreements with the crowd, still believed in a shared vision for a better future. Then, as if to diffuse the tension even further, he added with a slight smile, "And honestly, I didn't think I'd be dealing with this many protesters on a ski trip. I was just hoping for some decent snow and maybe a hot cocoa." A few people in the crowd couldn't help but chuckle, and for the first time, the hostility in the air seemed to soften just a little. Vance wasn't trying to change their minds with a brilliant political argument. He was showing them a side of himself that wasn't just about policies or sound bites. It was about genuine connection, acknowledging that he understood their frustrations without diminishing their concerns. For a brief moment, the protesters seemed unsure of how to respond. The hard edge of their previous attacks had softened, and they were left to grapple with the unexpected calmness Vance had exhibited. What they had thought would be a fight, a moment to put him in his place, had turned into an opportunity for dialogue. The ski resort was still, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. And then, Vance did the unthinkable. He reached out. The atmosphere at the ski resort was charged with a palpable tension, yet JD Vance stood there, his posture calm, but his mind sharply focused. The crowd of protesters, which had been so loud and hostile just moments earlier, now seemed hesitant. They weren't sure what to make of his response. A mixture of understanding, sincerity, and even a touch of humor. Vance noticed that some of the protesters had begun to lower their signs, their faces softening slightly. The ones who had been the most vocal were now silent, seemingly unsure of how to engage with him. He could see in their eyes that they weren't expecting this. This wasn't the confrontation they had anticipated. Instead of continuing to escalate the situation, Vance took a small step forward, closing the distance between him and the protesters. It wasn't a move of aggression, but a gesture of approachability, one that would have been easy to misinterpret, but he knew this was the moment to take a chance. "Look," Vance said, his voice steady but empathetic, "I'm not here to pretend I'm perfect, or that I've always had all the answers. I don't have all the solutions, but I do care about the issues we're all facing. We may disagree on the way to get there, but we all want better for this country. I want better." He paused and looked directly at the protesters, some of whom were still standing with their arms crossed. Then, with a calm but deliberate move, he extended his hand toward the closest protester, an older man who had been at the forefront of the chanting. The man hesitated for a brief moment. It was clear that he didn't know how to respond. This wasn't the kind of situation where you shake hands with your opponent in a heated protest. But as Vance stood there, unflinching and genuine, the protester finally reached out, grasping Vance's hand. The crowd fell into a quiet stillness. It wasn't just the protesters who were watching. The onlookers at the resort, including other skiers and staff, had gathered nearby to see what would happen. And now they too were silent, watching as Vance, without a single word of condemnation or defensive rhetoric, reached out to connect. The protester, a man in his late 50s, looked Vance in the eyes. There was a flicker of surprise, even appreciation, in his gaze. "I didn't expect this," he said, his voice almost softening. "You could have walked away, but you didn't." Vance smiled, a simple, unguarded smile. "I'm not here to walk away from tough conversations. I'm here to listen. I'm here to try, even when it's uncomfortable." The older man nodded, then turned to his fellow protesters. For the first time, they seemed unsure of how to proceed. The fiery rhetoric had dissipated, replaced by a moment of reflection. One by one, the protesters slowly started to lower their signs. It wasn't that they agreed with Vance. It was that they had seen something real, something that transcended political ideologies. For a moment, they had been forced to consider that perhaps this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about engaging with each other as human beings, even when they fundamentally disagreed. Vance stepped back, looking at the group as a whole. "I don't think we'll solve everything here today," he said, still speaking to the group but looking around at the people who had gathered to watch. "But maybe we can start the conversation. It doesn't have to be us versus them. It can be us working together trying to figure out what's best for all of us." And just like that, the crowd began to break the tension. The protesters, still skeptical, began to chat among themselves. The energy in the air shifted from hostility to something more akin to thoughtful dialogue. It wasn't a win for Vance in the traditional sense. There was no definitive agreement or sudden change in stance. But the fact that he had managed to turn a volatile situation into a meaningful exchange had left a lasting impression. The rest of the protesters, some still skeptical, others now more open, saw that JD Vance was willing to be vulnerable in a way that few political figures dared. And as they began to disperse, the shift was undeniable. Vance had not only withstood the attack, he had opened the door for something better, a conversation, not an argument. The people who had watched from the sidelines felt the change too. The incident wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about human connection, about finding common ground even in the most uncomfortable circumstances. As Vance walked toward the lift, his head held high, there was a sense of accomplishment that wasn't about winning. It was about how he had turned a moment of conflict into a moment of growth, for both himself and for the people involved. The moment of tension had passed, but the ripples were still being felt throughout the resort. JD Vance, having extended his hand in what could only be described as a surprising gesture of grace, had not only managed to diffuse a potentially volatile situation, but he had also set something in motion that few could have predicted. As the protesters began to disperse, there was a marked shift in their demeanor. The anger that had fueled their chants earlier had been replaced by something more reflective, something almost receptive. The older protester who had shaken Vance's hand stood off to the side, speaking quietly with the other demonstrators. His words weren't loud or filled with anger. Instead, they were measured, and those around him seemed to listen with a new openness. Vance watched the scene from a distance, but he didn't linger in the moment. His goal wasn't to gloat or even claim a victory. It was to move forward, to show that genuine engagement could sometimes bridge the divides that seemed so impossible to cross. But something caught his attention. The older protester, the one who had shaken his hand, walked back over to Vance. His expression had softened from the earlier hostility. "I didn't expect that from you," he began, his voice sincere. "I thought you were just another politician, but I see now. Maybe I judged you wrong. You didn't run from the issue, you didn't attack, you just stood there and listened." Vance, though surprised, simply nodded. "We all have a tendency to judge too quickly. Sometimes all it takes is hearing each other out. He paused, looking out at the retreating protesters. I'm not asking you to agree with me on everything. Hell, I don't expect that from anyone. But maybe, just maybe, we can all agree that listening is a good place to start. The older man looked back at his friends, who had now gathered together, talking among themselves. There was an unmistakable shift in their energy. The harshness had faded, replaced by a more open exchange of ideas. I'll admit I wasn't expecting any of this, the protester continued. I thought you were just another guy out for himself. But I can see now that there's something different about how you approach things. For a moment, Vance didn't know how to respond. This wasn't a typical political interaction. This wasn't a transactional exchange or a series of debates. This was, in a way, a genuine connection. Something real emerging from a place that had originally felt like it was destined to remain stuck in conflict. I'm just trying to make a difference, one conversation at a time, Vance said. He took a breath and added, You don't have to agree with me on everything. But if we start seeing each other as people, not as enemies, not as the other side, we'll get further than any protest ever could. The older protester hesitated, clearly processing what Vance had said. After a few moments, he gave a slow nod. Maybe I'll think about that, he said quietly. As Vance watched him walk back to the group, he could see that something had changed. The protesters didn't suddenly abandon their cause or beliefs, but the environment had shifted. The heat of the protest had been replaced by a moment of reflection, and Vance had been a catalyst for that change, not through grand speeches or fiery rhetoric, but through a simple act of listening and human connection. As the protesters packed up and slowly made their way out of the area, the crowd around the resort also seemed to settle. The earlier tension had dissipated, and people who had been silently watching the entire exchange began to talk to each other. Vance had not only defused the situation, but he had sparked a conversation about the very nature of political discourse, a conversation that went beyond partisanship and reached into the heart of human engagement. For Vance, this moment was a reminder that political divides were not always as deep as they seemed. It was about breaking down the walls, one person at a time, one handshake, one conversation. As he walked away, the sounds of the resort, the clinking of ski poles and the laughter of families, seemed to reclaim the space once filled with protest. Vance had not just survived the encounter, he had transformed it. The days following JD Vance's encounter with the protesters at the ski resort were filled with a quiet reflection. The media picked up on the story, but not in the way many would have expected. There were no scandalous headlines or controversial sound bites. Instead, Vance was being praised for his approach to the confrontation. This wasn't a typical political story, but it was one that was gaining significant attention. The headlines read, JD Vance chooses dialogue over division at ski resort. A new kind of leadership. JD Vance stands firm yet calm amid protest. JD Vance, the politician who listens. It wasn't just the media that took notice. People everywhere began to see Vance in a new light. In the weeks after the incident, his social media channels exploded with positive messages from people across the political spectrum. Comments poured in from individuals who had once dismissed him as just another divisive figure, only to express admiration for how he had handled the protesters with dignity and respect. I don't always agree with Vance, one user tweeted, but I have to admit, the way he handled those protesters was classy. We need more leaders like that. Another comment read, It's refreshing to see a politician who's not afraid to listen to the other side. This is the kind of leadership we need. The shift in public perception was immediate. People who had viewed Vance as polarizing or even out of touch began to reconsider. His response wasn't one of defensiveness or bitterness. It was one of openness, understanding, and above all, patience. It was a stark contrast to the typical responses from politicians who, when faced with opposition, often resort to anger or insults to maintain their position. The turning point didn't just affect Vance's relationship with the public, it redefined his role in the political landscape. He was no longer just a figure who espoused certain political beliefs. He was a leader who showed that true strength in leadership didn't lie in winning arguments, but in making an effort to engage and understand those who disagreed with you. His image transformed from a politician who often spoke to the right-wing base to someone who was capable of bridging political divides. People started to see him as someone who valued respectful discourse and constructive criticism, a refreshing change in an era marked by inflammatory rhetoric and entrenched ideologies. Politicians from both sides of the aisle began to reach out. Some even invited him to speak at bipartisan events where issues like health care, education, and economic reform were discussed without the usual party-driven gridlock. Vance was no longer simply a conservative voice. He was emerging as a potential leader who could unite people around common goals rather than focus on their differences. The day after the ski resort protest, Vance received an unexpected message. It was from the same older protester who had shaken his hand, the one who had been at the forefront of the demonstration. "Mr. Vance, I wanted to personally thank you for your response that day. I didn't think I would ever say this, but I've been reflecting on it, and I believe you're sincere in wanting to help the working class. I might not agree with everything you stand for, but I respect the way you handled things. I think you gave us all something to think about." This message was a reminder that even in the most charged moments, there was a chance for change. Vance didn't win over the protesters that day with polished arguments or political jargon. He won them over with his authenticity, his ability to listen, and his willingness to meet people where they were, even if it meant facing criticism head-on. Over the following months, Vance continued to build on this new foundation. He used his platform to push for bipartisan initiatives, focusing on issues like health care reform, income inequality, and job creation. His approach was no longer about rallying support from one side or the other, but about creating dialogue and bringing people together, a vision that was gaining more traction every day. It became clear that this was just the beginning of something bigger. JD Vance had shown that the power of political leadership wasn't in who you could silence or outshout, but in how you could connect and work together, even with those who didn't share your views. In the world of politics, this was an approach that was rare, but perhaps desperately needed. And as the political landscape continued to shift, one thing was certain. JD Vance had redefined leadership for a generation of Americans who were tired of the same old political games. He had proven that it was possible to make an impact, not just through bold policies or speeches, but through the simple act of listening and engaging with respect. As time passed, JD Vance's career continued to evolve, but the moment at the ski resort, the one where he calmly faced a crowd of protesters and changed the course of a potential confrontation, became a defining chapter in his story. It wasn't just a moment of personal victory, but one that had a ripple effect across the political landscape. Vance had shown that in an era of division, there was still room for unity, and that true leadership came not from the loudest voice but from the ability to engage with humility and respect. This moment of grace under pressure didn't just define Vance in the eyes of the public. It redefined the way politics could be done. The impact of his actions went far beyond the ski resort. As Vance moved forward in his career, he increasingly became a symbol of a new kind of politics, one that valued dialogue over shouting matches and solutions over empty rhetoric. He began speaking at various forums, not just to conservative groups, but to diverse audiences. He was invited to town halls, universities, and even corporate events, where his message of cross-party collaboration and empathy resonated deeply. Many of his colleagues in Washington, especially those who had grown weary of the constant bickering and polarization that had dominated the Capitol for years, began to see Vance as a figure who could bring fresh energy to the table. They saw someone who wasn't just interested in winning battles. He was interested in finding common ground. His reputation, once built on his political ideologies, was now centered around his ability to foster understanding, a skill that was sorely missing in modern politics. Vance also began working on projects that were designed to bring about real, sustainable change for working-class Americans. His initiatives focused on economic reform, job creation, and access to affordable health care, with an emphasis on bipartisan support. He wasn't interested in creating division for the sake of ideological purity. He was focused on solving problems and bringing people together to create lasting change. The ski resort incident became a turning point, not only in his career but in the wider political discourse. It was a moment that challenged the narrative, one that questioned the traditional ways of responding to conflict. Instead of fighting fire with fire, Vance had opted for listening, understanding, and human connection. This new approach caught the attention of those both on the left and the right, who saw that Vance was not just another partisan figure but someone who was willing to build bridges, even with those who were openly hostile to him. As his influence grew, Vance's legacy began to take shape. His leadership wasn't defined by a series of policies or victories, but by the quiet, deliberate way he chose to engage with the world. His actions spoke volumes, and they set a new precedent for the kind of politician the public desired, one who was authentic, empathetic, and focused on long-term solutions rather than short-term wins. In the years that followed, many political observers began to point to Vance as a model for future leaders. His success wasn't just in how he handled adversity, or even in the policies he advocated for. It was in the example he set for future generations about how to engage with the public honestly and respectfully.